So welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a break that was restful, a little bit of change of pace, and I hope that your discussions in the breakout sessions were rich and rewarding and thought-provoking. I know the one that I was privileged to participate in was all those things. So just check about where we are in our process. We're not going to hear reports from the individuals, our colleagues who were given the assignment to report out on the discussions in those breakout sessions. And that'll be Susan, Abby, and Chris. And I'll do them right back to back so that we can get all the raw material into our discussion. And then we'll have a group discussion about what we've just heard, and then we'll take another break at 3:30, and then after that break, come back for Danielle's discussion with Catherine. So that's where we are. But before we start that, I just want to reflect on where we were when we went into our small breakout sessions. And we had just heard from Aneka about yet another painful episode, this one in her home state of North Carolina, another reminder of yet another Black man dying at the hands of law enforcement. And Aneka said something that I want to underscore and focus on, which is that she felt very emotional at that moment, and that might show in her presentation. We've come together at a time when there's deep pain being felt, particularly by our colleagues of color and communities around the country. And I feel just so fortunate that we can come together and be there for each other at a difficult time. But I also need to acknowledge that that's not a uniform experience within our group, and those of us who are white are not experiencing those events in the same way. And in another breakout session, one that I was not part of, this was an explicit topic of conversation. I just want to bring it back to the full group and to acknowledge that difference, and to acknowledge that pain and the deep emotions that come with that, and to say to people, if they feel that the discussion is just too difficult, too raw, at the moment, we understand that, and if it means you want to take some time away from this discussion, please feel absolutely free to do so. And certainly if that brings emotions to the fore, that's a very important part of our time together, and an important vehicle for communicating precisely what we're talking about here, which is the deep nature of the harm that has been carried out, basically, by the way we approach the issues of justice in the country. So with special recognition of that difference within our group, and that we're at a difficult moment nationally, but all of us who are thinking about the issues that arise every day and the long history that they represent, are feeling a lot of pain and anguish and frustration and anger. And I guess the corollary that follows that observation is, and we talked about it last time, we talked about it a week ago, we've talked about it over time, we talked about it in Detroit. You'll remember how much we focused on trauma in the Detroit Roundtable. This is also a time to take care of ourselves, and to recognize that there's a need for people who are doing the work to engage in whatever are the appropriate for you forms of self-care and connectivity and solidarity with others. So I thank those who raised up this issue in one of the breakout sessions. Thank Aneka for being so clear and explicit about where she was, but want her to know that she's not alone, and that we embrace this challenge precisely because of what it represents, is the deep hurt and the deep harm, the need for healing and justice. So thank you for being who you are and for making this part of our Square One conversation. So we're going to turn next to Susan Glisson, who was the reporter in the group that I was part of. And after she does her report out, we'll ask Anamika, who was our Square One staff person assigned to that group, to see if there's anything that she would like to add to Susan's summary. And we'll do these back to back with Abby and Chris, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So Susan.
Thanks, Jeremy. As I said in the small group, I do not have the gift that Bruce Western has. So I'm going to lift up. There was so much richness in the conversation. I fear I will leave out something important. So I trust that my colleagues in the conversation will chime in. Jeremy's a wonderful facilitator and got us going. And Courtney really grounded us in the conversation about how the idea, the concept of the power of humanity keeps coming up. Really, Ineka's idea that Neka's idea, sorry, that no one person is irredeemable. But how do we maintain? Courtney asked this great question: how do we maintain humanity without sort of, if I may use the word, settling, kind of for reform instead of for full abolition? If the system is irredeemable, but the people are not, how do you hold that? How do you hold that tension? Marcia talked about how structures flatten us, they dehumanize us. And so to resist, she shows up as her full self. Courtney noted the kind of exhaustion that then creates in folks who are trying to be their full selves in systems that are dehumanizing. Donna noted as well the sort of the sense of overwhelm at how much there is to do and what steps there are to take, but knowing clearly that we have to get to the roots of the problem, and there are many roots. She encouraged us with noting Finding Nemo, the idea of just keep swimming. Jeremy lifted up the idea that from last night's conversation about with Daryl and Marlon about political education and potentially political education being a precondition to abolition. And then Courtney, noted part of what needs to be understood is that white supremacy culture is the air in which all of us breathe. It shapes and limits and affects everybody, so that just bringing brown folks into a space with a group doesn't automatically fix things because of what white supremacy culture has done to dehumanize. Marcia lifted that up as well, the sort of, another kind of genocide that white supremacy culture makes Black and brown people hate themselves. We lifted up, so that idea of internalized racism. Donna was clear that in Texas, they absolutely know the power of political engagement and political education because they work really hard to try to prevent it from happening. So Jeremy pondered what the outcome of an initiative might look like that really intentionally engaged in education and truth telling. And given the skill set of the folks in the room, that's a kind of a muscle that could be exercised right away. There was a sense of sort of understanding this is white supremacy is one way that this shows up. If there's Donna said there's a human tendency to create and sustain hierarchies and power differentials. So we want to keep that big idea in mind. And then Eric really just laid it out, lifting up this really powerful question of what if we start with de-gunning the police? How might that affect how we are policed? He suggested that law enforcement needs to have healing as much as communities do in order to repair and restore balance and harmony. That the trauma that police officers have is being reflected back onto communities in more harm. So then Jeremy asked what the big question is: how large is the healing circle? Who gets to be a part of the healing circle? Involvement has to be real, authentic, and it can't be forced. But we're at a particular interesting moment in time that Black Lives Matter has opened up. and we've got opportunities to do some good work. Hope that was
great.
okay.
Yeah, more than okay. That was great. We'll turn to Anamika to add to, underscore, emphasize anything from Susan's overview.
Hi, everyone. That was beautiful, Susan. You did a phenomenal job. I guess I will just lift up how Susan contributed to the conversation. I noticed that didn't make it in there. And she shared that what it always goes back to her is organizing. And while that work is laborious and unglamorous and sometimes even boring, that's what we have to do. And then she also underscored a point that really was a theme of this conversation around history. If you don't know the history, then it's easier for us to deny the truth, which is then what led folks into the political education conversation. So, and then one last thing is Eric shared a little bit more about toxic masculinity and the very Euro male centric tendencies that have come to dominate the West. And he shared that from his perspective, that perspective has taken us as far as it can, and any further it'll take us, it will likely cause harm. So that's what I'll add, but that was wonderful, Susan. Thanks.
Great.
Anamika.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Anamika. We are going to keep moving along and ask Abby to report out on the discussion in her group, and she will be supported in that by Madison.
Great. Thank you, Jeremy. So myself and Keith and Bruce and NECA and Danielle and Monica, we're all together in a group. And I just want to start by thanking Jeremy for finding such an eloquent way to name attention that I've been thinking about. So thank you for that. As we dive into this. So in having this conversation about abolition versus irreducible minimum, at the end, what I think we ended up coming to is no matter where you stand or what you think about this, that the value really should be that abolition is the goal. Even if you can't get there, that pointing all of the efforts into that direction is really what's important, even if it's sort of in phases. So Danielle at one point brought up the prison or carceral systems in Europe. And is that good enough? Does it work? And we kind of sat in a conversation around maybe that's like a less bad option. Just, is that something that we might want to hold on to or not? Is it something our social fabric could actually accomplish in that space? But really, how might that type of penal system be a journey towards abolition? Clearly, it's not abolition because it exists in its first place. We've had a lot of conversation about redemption, like Susan just summarized. NECA mentioned that no person is irredeemable, but the system is irredeemable. Keith added that society needs to redeem itself. And we talked about how redemption needs to be consistent, and accountability on all levels is something that we should all lean into, no matter how hard or uncomfortable that can be, particularly as we were talking about the results of the Chauvin case and the verdict there. Monica leaned hard into vision and future thinking, and really thinking about and talking about what kind of world are we building towards? What do we want communities to look like? And I really appreciated that framing, because it really makes the intangible and kind of the foggy and the unknown create some clarity. And even if we have all different wants and visions, that is really important to lean into that. And then we just talked about how do you make the change happen, and the critical resistance. And Keith mentioned his son asking, what would a world without prisons look like? And how, when we're done in this space, how the next generation coming up maybe could help grow the seeds that we've planted, and that they would be better able to visualize a more thriving and successful and prisonless and carceral stateless future together. And then Danielle also mentioned that in order to do that, we have to be able to connect all levels of government and systems from the city to the state to the feds to create national, meaningful, and permanent change. And towards the end, we talked about ambiguity and how change is needed. Moving towards abolition is critical, but that we need to lean into that ambiguity, and it's okay if we don't know what it's going to look like. But the importance of putting your weight forward and continuing to charge and agitate and capitalize on all of the momentum, hopefully will add to the constancy and just continuing to really just lean into it, even though for some of our colleagues, the ambiguity might be hard to buy into, because folks need to know what's going to happen before they engage in the future. But I think that's some common ground that these convenings continue to build, and just remembering that the foundation is really moving towards abolition.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Abby. And Madison, what would you like to add?
Hi, everyone. I'm Madison. Abby, you did a really phenomenal job. A huge core of our conversation was about the ambiguity and specifically moving from where we are now and where we want to be. And Danielle gave the example that in education and all of these other domains, it's a lot easier to galvanize people and bring people along to have these conversations. So we talked about the concrete steps to get us there and the different modes in keeping consistency and making sure or ensuring that people are brought into the process of moving towards abolition. So that's just one point I want to underscore. Thank you. Again, Abby, you really did well at summarizing.
Great. And thank you, Madison. And then Chris, to be supported by Evie.
Thank you. I just want to start by saying thank you for the opportunity to participate in these small groups. We got to experience one of the most intimate, real, and at times raw conversations that I've been in a while. And so I just kind of want to start from the end, and we'll get back to the beginning. But Nicole acknowledged that this is a vulnerable time, and that we're all kind of experiencing vulnerability, but certainly people who are Black or brown are experiencing it in much different ways. And so, Jeremy, I just want to say thank you again for acknowledging that and for eloquently giving us the space to own that in our conversations. We kind of started with the question of what would be, what are the identifiable irreducible minimums? And our group quickly didn't even really entertain that question and went straight to abolition as the goal. Vivian started us off by saying that she had a very hard time embracing a concept of a roadmap of how to improve the current system or how to, get to where we need to be. She said that she feels like that we are in an emergency room kind of situation, and that we need to acknowledge that, and that it's very, very important. She kind of got us started on this by raising something that Marlon said last night, and that was, even if we move to a new system where we had, say, social workers instead of correctional officers, if we're not careful, social workers could become racist, and we could buy in, or we could, have this structural systematic racism creep in. And so Vivian very, very pointedly said, the question that we need to be asking ourselves is what is it that we cannot accept? And then let's get rid of it. Let's just start getting rid of the things that we agree that we cannot accept. Emily very quickly came in and talked quite extensively and comprehensively about the need to focus on process. And in essence, she said that outcomes will never be any different so long as the process is not changed. And that if we really want to get to where we need to be, the focus really ought to be on establishing the process. We spent a great deal of time talking about how process matters. but another point that I thought was very important is that as we talk about a new paradigm or changes, it's incredibly important that we not leave those behind who are caught in the current system. Emily said that it would be very unjust to have a vision without considering the pragmatic applications to those who are still in the system that we have today. We had a very decent conversation around what changing the process looks like and how do we begin to change the power structure and the resources that support the current system, and understood and acknowledged that so long as the white male majority continues to make the decisions and create the system, that the outcomes will be the same. And that even with new funding, if we don't have a different process in place with different people making the decisions and making the rules, that there would be no difference. So process matters. And since I would say that our group probably believes that you won't have to worry about the outcome or the product so long as the process is right. So we spent a great deal of time talking about the power structure and the resources that would allow a new system to come into being, and how we can create that. And the statement was made that we're going to have to unroot the current power structure to allow for a better process. We're just going to have to ultimately get to that point. And that money that is appropriated, if the rules aren't written correctly, the money's going to go to the same entities who are going to find a way to capture it and continue the same work that's happening right now. We talked about some examples of how for way too long, we've been trying to improve a system that just doesn't work, and finding areas within the system that may be less harmful, but in reality turn out to be just as harmful. Electronic monitoring. We talked about hotspot policing. We talked about the body cam initiative. And at the end of the day, it's time to start over. I mean, it's really time to acknowledge that what we have in place is just not working. It's time to reimagine the work that we're doing and make sure that we have a power structure in place that allows people to lead who need to be leading. It's people, it's the Black community, it's the Latino community that needs to be leading in establishing the system. And that there will be a struggle in shifting these resources from systems that embody structural racism to individuals and communities that can help reduce violence. We also had a very candid conversation of how scholars oftentimes want to study and develop solutions within the current system, and how we need to call that out too if ultimately we're going to get to the point that we start to truly reimagine our criminal justice system, or our approach to criminal justice issues. Nicole said it's also very important how we speak about things, and we kind of moved from an academic discussion to a practical discussion with Pastor Mike being a part of our group and directly involved in forming some initiatives and some direction around the funding that's coming forward in the Biden administration for public safety. And Nicole reminded us, rather than saying that we're going to invest in the most violent communities, that's not fair. We should be saying that we're going to invest in communities that are most victimized or that are most under-resourced. And we talked about how we can be intentional about making sure that we are not including, but replacing the current structure with Black-led, Latino-led individuals to determine how these resources will be invested and how they will be utilized. And that it's also important to look long-term and not just short-term, and not just think of, not just settle for investments to be made in a 2-year or a 3-year or in a 5-year sort of period of time, but really begin to look at longevity in investment. Something else that I thought was very important is to think about how we measure the success of a reimagined system. And Emily pointed out that, oftentimes we look at recidivism rates or a reduction in recidivism as potential success. And she said that's wrong, and that we ought to really consider about asset development and asset growth within communities to determine what a successful reimagined approach would look like. Again, I would just say thank you to everyone who participated in our group. I would end by saying that John sort of, for me, kind of put a fine point on our discussion as we were talking about very practical ways to what do we do now in this moment in time. And John offered up that it's time to call for a moratorium on police stops, on auto stops, until we can, stop the tragic events that are happening today. We just need to stop what we're doing so that we don't continue to see the same thing play out over and over again.
Thanks so much, Chris. You covered a lot of ground. Evie, what would you like to add to that?
Yeah, well, it's nice to be here with all of you guys. So thanks for having me. Chris did a really wonderful job of kind of highlighting some of the things that we discussed in our small group. So really, I just want to kind of re-emphasize some of the things he was talking about. In particular, Pastor Mike was talking a lot about the ways that his group that's doing this violence prevention work and the initiative that Biden has put out for public safety have been working to rewrite like $10 billion worth of RFPs and trying to think about, and Vivian and Emily and Nicole, like basically everyone was in agreement about the ways that how RFPs really can have a fundamental effect on who is eligible for funding, and also what outcomes are being measured. Chris mentioned recidivism is often way too overemphasized, but also who is eligible for receiving these kinds of finances. And a lot of times those people who have worked with system actors in the past, and Nicole mentioned this specifically, are those that are immediately thought of to be the first people to receive funding for future research. So those people that have been involved working in, police offices or organizations often are the first people that this money, gravitate towards this money. So thinking about new and creative ways that resource allocation can happen was something that I thought was super interesting about the conversation. And then most importantly, I think I just wanted to reemphasize the fact that it was really powerful how intimate our conversation got so quickly, and just kind of really emphasizes how deeply people bring themselves to this work and to these conversations. So I just wanted to basically extend my gratitude for letting me be part of that conversation, even if I was just a listener. So thank you.
Thanks, Evie. So just a listener. I want this entire screen to just recognize that Bruce and Catherine and I have the great privilege every 2 weeks of having a meeting of something called the Square One Steering Committee, I think we call ourselves, where we get to sit with Anamika and Madison and Evie and talk about the future of the Square One project. We learn from them. They are driving this work. They are the hope for the future. And even though they don't show up physically, because their videos are off right now. They show up in lots of other ways. So we're grateful to them, and this gives me a chance to say thank you to our colleagues who are just spectacular. Oh, look at all those hearts and applause and everything. So look at the ground that's been covered in the breakout groups. And I said this morning that the breakout group experience for me last time was so rich and so just iterative, and the communication was so easy and back and forth that it really helped me think about what we had done in the morning. And I hope that you've had that experience as well. But I'm inviting anybody who would like to pick up on any thread. It's an open discussion at this point for the next 20-25 minutes or so. Any point that was referenced that's a new one. So rather than go back over what we've discussed before, and we've covered a lot of ground already, what struck you as being new, not from your group, but from another group? So just to respect the work done in the other breakout groups, when you were hearing the reports back from Susan and Kevin, Susan and Chris and Abby, and the supporting work by the Square One team, did something hit you when you say that's new and I want to work it a little bit. I want to work it within this group. What would you find that really got you thinking in a different way? Not what we've discussed before, not what was discussed in your group, where you say, God, that was fresh. That was really fresh and additive to where we are. Somebody will come up with something, and use your blue hand if you could.
I just wanted to say that I was really moved, but also I felt personally very troubled by what Pastor Mike had revealed in our group. And I again, I know you said to speak outside the group, but
it's okay. It's okay.
I think the idea that I am an academic researcher, right? I'm a peer assist. I apply for grants. I don't, but I've also kind of pushed back from some of that because I feel like it requires you to, in some ways, create research that will allow the police to keep wanting to work with you. And I've never been able, I have a standard that would say I won't do that. And, but what Pastor Mike was kind of saying was that, it was almost like he was fighting the academics. And that really is heartbreaking for me. And I feel like there's enough of us here that are our academics that we should be able to mobilize on his behalf and on other activists, behalf. Because, I think, there is a way that we can create research that merely just amplifies the violence that we're seeing, things like hotspot policing, things that are solutions, but really just more forms of incarceration, body cams as a solution for accountability when accountability is what police are pushing back on. So I just put that out there. I don't know the solution. I mean, Jonathan and I both said, if there was some kind of document that we all could sign on behalf of, we know violence prevention money is coming, and it should include these players at the table and should not exclude, and it would require us to stand up to some of our colleagues, and that's really difficult and really hard to do. But I feel like in this moment it is required. And I put that out there because, there's so many of us academics at the table. Some have actually participated in previous Square One projects, but they've been less inclined to say critical things about police, even at this moment. And so it really is a balancing act. But I think after hearing Pastor Mike make this plea, it really does, to me, there feels like a sense of urgency, because if the money is co-opted away from experts like Pastor Mike, that would truly be a tragedy. And if we stay silent about it, it feels like we'd be complicit. So
I'm seeing some nodding of heads here. Monica was certainly in agreement. And I don't know if you were with us, Pastor Mike, but if you want to restate the observation that you made, it's an important one, and we do have scholars at the table, and we're all in touch with scholarly communities where we could carry a message from Square One.
And Pastor Mike, I don't want to restate your eloquent words. I was just very struck by it as an academic who has seen on the other side, thinking, wait, weren't you the person doing hotspot policing, targeting Black communities, and and looking the other way when you saw police doing nefarious things? And now you're applying for a grant for body cams, so you can also get that money, which is about police accountability. It's not compatible ethically, and yet it's happening within the academy. And that when Pastor Mike also observed it from another vantage point, I think that to me was powerful.
Well, thank you, Doc. I think felt like I was emoting more than I was eloquently stating something. So I don't know if I can capture that lightning in a bottle, but I'll just the example. So, many of you know that we've been able to secure a $5 billion commitment from the Biden administration to fund peace, or what we're calling scale up public health approaches for gun violence prevention. And the Biden administration has agreed to put that inside the infrastructure bill. But there was also another effort to open up to $10 billion worth of grants in 25 agencies across 25 programs across 5 agencies. And so just part of what we're talking about the RFP process is, what does it mean for us to build into RFPs these kinds of safeguards that the resources are going to Black and brown community violence prevention groups on the ground, and not being sucked up by and I don't mind mentioning the names that I mentioned: the Everytowns, the Giffords, the Bradys, the David Kennedys, the Gary Sluckins, the Thomas Apps, like the range of scholars, criminologists, big firms, advocacy groups that historically have literally been obstructionists to us trying to replace or at least scale up these efforts that are Black, brown led in communities across the country, or even just this body of work. And I guess part of what I was sharing is that if it's true that $600 million is going to be coming to a select group of cities across the country that reach these kinds of measures around the number of gun-related shootings and homicides, we're seeing these groups that have historically either been lukewarm, cool, or obstructionists literally reconstituting themselves to compete for these public dollars that we are intending to go to actually build a new public safety sector that centers and is led by Black and brown folks. And they're using the academy, they're using their big organizations to lap all of us smaller Black and brown led groups who don't have that kind of national infrastructure to be able to compete in that. I'm certainly one of the folks who ain't afraid to call this out, but a lot of other folks are fearful because it impacts people's funding, it impacts people getting blackballed. A lot of this is relationships behind the scenes with folks at the federal level, in the White House, and the DOJ, at the municipality level. And so, as Square One being a place that I found to be a center of gravity, that at least for me, where it's like our values, we're trying to live them out actually through how we lead and how we act. I was just saying some of these dollars perhaps we could use to help build out a more counterbalance to this kind of criminologist sector that pathologizes and profits off of Black criminality, to use Khalil Gibran Muhammad's language, and help appreciate that there is a new way to deal with public safety that does not require you showing up to a fight and shooting a Black girl 4 times, in the chest, right? Like there are literally other ways that we could do this, but we need resources and we need the expertise of folks who can wage some of these fights, so we're just not all having to do it by ourselves. And so that's the best I can do to recapture kind of what I was ranting about.
Well, your best is always pretty good. So thank you for that, Pastor Mike. We can continue this theme. You didn't particularly call out the scholarly community, which Nicole had taken from your earlier conversation. Just want to leave that on the table as well, because I think that's an important challenge. And I'm reminded of the discussion we had last Square One Roundtable with Elizabeth Hinton on the history of federal funding that came with certain expectations, at least rhetorically, where the money never went for community organizing, community capacity building, community voice. And are we learning from that history? If she were here, she would urge us to do that. Who would like to pick up on the thread of this federal opportunity, which is relatively recent? We've talked about it. I'd say it's less than a month since that's been announced, and lots of organizations. And Pastor Mike has showed in his slide. There's a wonderful poster, basically, of some of the people who've been leading this effort, who are involved in the community level anti-violence work, and it's a tribute to them that they're able to bring it to this point and get support from Susan Rice and others, so that this is even a possibility. But now is the time to be protective, I guess, of that work and make sure that the intentions are carried out. So the floor is open to continue on that discussion, or anything else that people would like to bring before the group. Yes, Courtney.
I thought I saw Monica's hand first, but I'll jump in. So, as someone who runs a small nonprofit, funded a small nonprofit, I think this is, and I'm also an adjunct professor, so I sit in both of these lanes. This is a really important conversation in terms of nonprofits and the work that we do. We're boots on the ground all the time, but we rarely get the funding, because in the funding game, you have to have money to get money. And so the reasons why university professors often get the bigger grants is because they have the institutional budget that supports the grant that they're applying for. And so it would be great if RFPs accounted for smaller organizations who can't have robust research because we don't have the budget for. So it's like a chicken and the egg kind of thing. They want you to have all these fleshed out metrics, but you don't have the money to pay a researcher to actually do the work that they're asking you to have. And so while we will see things in our community about researchers coming in to help, researchers often come in to help themselves. And I can say that because I sit on both sides, and I've been able to say to my colleagues, okay, you want to come in with my kids, my Black and brown kids, to do A, what are you going to do for this organization? And so I think we have to start doing more of those kinds of things as academics, really thinking about what are you bringing to the organization, just not what you're taking away and you're going to go off and you're going to write articles and books and not give anything back to the community that you were researching. So those are just some of my thoughts around this issue.
Thanks, Courtney. I would invite any of my Square One colleagues who would like to just report on a parallel activity that's under development now about sort of research methods. That sounds so dry. I don't mean the actual research methods, but the research enterprise. And how would the research enterprise be different with the sort of racial equity lens that we're bringing to it? We had this discussion in Detroit, you may recall, where there was some very direct challenges to some of the academics in the room, and that became a parallel conversation where there's hope now at the Justice Lab at Columbia to actually bring people together to facilitate that discussion. So, Bruce, not to put you on the spot, or Catherine or Namaka, who's working on this might be something that we could engage some of these folks on, thinking about bringing this conversation into that other table.
Yeah. So we're thinking about site-based work as part of the next chapter of the Square One work, and one of the things that we hear is that there's often an appetite for research among different community organizations and actors, but researchers are typically so tightly ensconced with public agencies and have been a resource for public agencies. There's an uneven playing field where there's information and analysis that state agencies have access to, that communities often do not. And so we're thinking about a role for researchers supporting community organizations, and and the frame for research questions should originate with communities, and researchers both in dialogue and collaboration with community actors in the way that they more typically are with state agencies. So we're trying to figure out, how do we design that? How do we play a role that's genuinely supportive and not self-interested in the way that Courtney and Pastor Mike have described, and that's what, and how can there be a role for community actors and organizations in the design and conduct of research that we often see with sort of research practice partnerships, and which involves working with state agencies. So we're in the process of conceptualizing that, designing that right now. And I think we're also hearing the concerns that Pastor Mike and Nicole and Courtney have raised, and we're trying to be responsive to it.
Yeah, and maybe just really quickly, if Anamika, if you're still where you can come on screen for just a second, Anamika's helping us put together a piece to go alongside that work with localities that Bruce mentioned. Anamika, you want to talk for just a minute about that?
Sure. Bruce, you did a really good job sharing some of the prompting questions that we've been considering. And I would just throw a few more into the mix. I think what we're hoping to do is kind of share that research can be values-based, which I think really comports with this roundtable. How can research be designed, conducted, and deployed to create a racially just and equitable world? How can it be used to advance liberation? And Bruce shared with you all, and of course we've heard this for a very long time, like that means that who's at the forefront must change. So in addition to those particular questions that perhaps the agenda will address, I've been considering a lot about the process that we're going to use to do such a roundtable. So like, who really needs to hear how research must change? Who off of whose backs or off of whose work or labor should they hear that from? How do we ensure that the roundtable process itself is an equitable, just, compassionate, loving place where folks aren't learning off of others? And then, so I've been really thinking about a process that can be employed to have a generative discussion. And then how can it be generative? What, connections are real and funding is a real thing. What else can come out of a discussion like this? What are the concrete, tangible things? And you know, I think that's something that I'm hoping to learn from this process with you all, so that we can continuously evolve and do better and be accountable to people in order to advance equity, racial justice, and liberation. So that's what I'll add. Thanks.
Thank you, Namaka, Bruce, and Catherine. Just to see where we are, we're going to take a break in about 5 minutes or so. Then we'll return for a discussion between Catherine and Danielle, which promises to be really exciting and timely. And it really is also so linked to what we're just talking about here, which is the operationalizing these values. So when you talk about what federal funding looks like, you know, that's you know, really getting down to brass tacks and who's quote unquote eligible, whatever that means, to apply for that funding, how's it distributed, and particularly in this case, which I really appreciate from Pastor Mike's intervention, is that this remarkable reality, which might in fact be a pivot point in paradigm shifting on safety and well-being and community-led interventions. Ironic, I think, that it might come from the federal government, but the fact that that's even a possibility is a tribute to those organizations that are listed on that poster. And we're fortunate two of them are Square One colleagues, Pastor Mike with his organization and Fatima Dreyer with Javi have been at the forefront, and others that we've been in touch with. So that's a moment to pay attention to. So yes, Nicole?
I just want to say that Professor Bell put a link in the chat that was written by Robert Vargas, and I think it really does encapsulate what the brave work that needs to be done. And it focuses on the crime lab at the University of Chicago and talks about, you know, how the lab's research in and of itself has, you know, focused on individual behavior. It sees Black people, Black communities as needing to be fixed, and that whole orientation is really, you know, one that reproduces racial stigma while not always solving the problem of violence. And it also cites Elizabeth Hinton's work. And so I really think it's an excellent, you know, kind of model for, I mean, you know, all of us can name who's doing this. I mean, I you know, it's not like we don't know. And I think, but it does take some acts of bravery like this to in some ways call it out and say, we need a new model of how scholarship should be done. And so I just, you know, thank you, Professor, for sharing that. And it's worth looking at as we think about moving forward.
Thanks, Nicole. And thanks, Monica, for finding that. Just put it on my screen and look at it in the next break. Danielle, we're going to ask you to close it out, and then we'll take a break and ask you to start us again. So, Dan, your thoughts on this?
I didn't mean to do that. It is just really on the research side. I just think this is an incredibly important conversation, and that the question is, from my point of view, how to empower nonprofits to use the existing research infrastructure that exists in the form of universities. Corporations show up on campus all the time and say, we're having trouble answering X and Y question, and we will give you a grant if you are willing to work on this question. So the question is really, how can nonprofits show up on campus and say, we are having problems answering X and Y, and we can give you a grant because the federal funds are flowing through us if you will work on this project. And I think, honestly, just setting up nonprofits to be the people making the RFPs to the academy would be transformative. And academics know how to do this. They do it for corporations. So it's really not about a change of habits. It's just a question of who's in the position to come on campus and say, we need X research done, and we've got grants that we can deliver if you can do this work on our behalf.
Thank you. So I'm putting in the chat, there's a group at CUNY that you might know about called the Public Science Project that has been really in my journey on this in the forefront of thinking about participatory action research. And there it is. You can check it out. They've got a great website. Proud to say that a number of John Jay students and faculty have been part of it. And there you go. Okay, so here we are. We are going to take, you feel like you've been pampered today with too many breaks. We're going to take another one, just to take another deep breath. And we're going to come back for the discussion led by Catherine with Danielle. And then we'll move towards the end of the day. What a full day it's already been. And the reason for this break is to just to sort of take stock and to come back with I was going to say a clear head. That's not right. I want your head to be full and crowded and messy and with lots of neurons bouncing around. So it's not quite a clear head, but just ready, just re-energized for a great discussion that's coming up. So we'll see you in 15 minutes. Is that right, Catherine? Yeah. Okay. And enjoy your break. And thanks for the work in the breakout sessions, for the summaries, and special thanks to Pastor Mike and Nicole for really focusing this last discussion. This is actionable with the research, and I know with Pastor Mike in the lead, it's actionable in terms of what the federal government is going to do with these funds, assuming that they're appropriated, a big question mark there. So it's actually a very good time to be raising these very concrete issues where we can have put our values to work. So thanks all, and we'll see you soon.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start gathering again here for the last part of our day today. Welcome back, everyone. All right, well, everyone I think is coming back on screen here. And so we will go ahead and get started with the last part of our conversation for today's roundtable convening. It's been a terrific ride and really a lot of really interesting ground covered thus far. And as we've dug in on these questions about the principles of the values of justice and what they are and how we can move towards them, we're ready this afternoon to talk about operationalizing the values of justice and to consider what guiding principles might look like. To lead us in that conversation, to get us kicked off, it is my great pleasure to introduce Danielle Allen, who is the James Bryan Conant University professor and the director of the Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University, who's gonna take us through some thoughts to get our conversation going. And as you've all seen, we've been trying to break up our format a little bit with this roundtable to give folks different ways to engage. So today we're gonna have Danielle start us our conversation as we often do, and then we'll open up for some group discussion after her presentation, during which we'll invite you all to join in, raise your electronic hands as usual, and we'll have some conversation among our group. And then we'll take another pause in about an hour, and Danielle is going to share with us a sort of a specific example of what these ideas might look like as applied in practice, and let us use that as sort of another jumping off point for our discussion. So that will take us through the next couple of hours, and then we'll have our usual wrap up with Bruce and finish our day together. So just want to give you all that little bit of a roadmap. So Danielle, it's so great to have you here, and I'm going to hand over to you to get us started in this conversation, building on these previous discussions about values, to help us think about what are the guiding principles, what are the mechanisms that can actually put this into place, and how can they guide us in our work. So I believe you have screen sharing powers in the magic of Zoom, and we'll hand it over to you to get us started, and encourage folks to think about your comments and your questions, and we'll come back for group discussion in a few minutes. Danielle, over to you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Catherine. I appreciate it. And I do have some things to share, but this is definitely a space for discussion and for jumping in. I think in many ways, I'll be retracing some ground you've already covered in the last few days of this Square One session. And I think everybody's ready to dig in and really lay out action pathways. So in that regard, if that's where the energy takes you, that's completely fine. So I will be responsive to you as we go. I took the question about operationalizing values quite literally, and understood it to have both a social science component and a practical sort of application component. So as a social science matter, I think one of the things that is really hard about working with values is that so many people in the social sciences are trained that their work has nothing whatsoever to do with values. They are positive social scientists, their jobs are empirical or modeling, and their job is really to characterize the world as it is. And a distinction between studying what is and thinking about what ought to be goes way back to David Hume, a philosopher and political economist, and has kind of shaped a lot of the way in which people think about research over time. It's problematic, I'll say something about that, the distinction between is and ought. But so that's one feature of what it means to think about operationalizing values. And then another is about this question of the movement from values to application and practical context. So I'm going to talk about both things and really make the case that the work belongs together, thinking about values and thinking about the empirical realities, both in terms of social science and in terms of how you transform them. So let me go ahead and share my screen. A lot of this is going to be, relatively speaking, theoretical. I am a political philosopher, so that's the starting point. But the goal is to get from there to the work in practice. So let's see. Of course, there we go. Okay. So I'm really going to focus on ethical reasoning. And the case that I am making, that I think you all experience day in and day out in your work, is that ethical reasoning is just a permanent part of our activities. Everybody on this call who is a practitioner or who is working on justice reform knows that. For the academic researchers, I think it's a bit of a matter of kind of coming into awareness about the centrality of values to even academic work. So at the end of the day, facts and values can't be separated from each other. That's the really fundamental point. The question of what facts are even salient or important to us already flows from a question of what we value. So when I see a data visualization, I'll show it to you later in this presentation there was one in the New York Times for 2015 by David Leonhardt and his colleagues called 1.5 million missing Black men. Some of you may have seen it or may remember it. And it was really just a sort of numbers-based diagnosis of how many African-American men were walking around in the community compared to numbers of African-American women. And it's a sort of huge gap between the presence of women and presence of men, and a lot of that reflecting incarceration, reflecting early mortality and the like. The fact that that's a fact we care about reflects already a set of values, the value of human life, of human dignity, of human worth, of an expectation of a certain degree of human thriving and flourishing for people. And then the fact that this set of facts was showing up that those things we value are not present. So the facts that we choose to pay attention to already flow from the values we bring into analyzing the world. So if in trying to do problem solving, that's a matter of diagnosing a problem, prescribing a plan of action, and then looking at that to see what further diagnosis you need. Facts and values are operating at every single one of those levels. For the diagnosis, in terms of what facts matter, for the prescription, for the plan of action, because how we act in the world is another thing that we make decisions about based on our values. So again, values are just never absent from any part of the work. So for that reason, I always like to call values out as their own moment when I'm talking to people about iterative problem solving. So that, instead of just thinking you've got a problem, you've got to diagnose it, come up with a prescription, come up with an action strategy, I like to ask people to take a moment to just stop and work on values explicitly so they can think about how their values are factoring into the work of diagnosing a problem, of coming up with the prescriptions and the like. Now, the interesting thing about recognizing that driving change and just plain living in the world in general requires all four of these moments: clarity about your values, being able to diagnose the world around you in terms of your values, develop prescriptions in relationship to them, and then action strategies that align with your values. There's another issue that it's not as if there's a single starting point in this process. You can really start from any part of the cycle. And here, I'm going to actually draw on the military as an interesting source of approaches to things. The military has a hard job to do in terms of trying to train soldiers to make really quick decisions in context of uncertainty. And they want those decisions to align with pre-existing protocols, including ethical protocols. But they also recognize that people are making fast decisions, and as they make those decisions, they'll be laying down new patterns. So the US military had developed a protocol that they called OODA, Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, as a way of getting at how people, in fact, operationalize values and do iterative problem solving and judgment work. So observe is a little bit like diagnosing your circumstances. Orienting is orienting in those circumstances in relationship to your values and the other core guiding principles you're using, and then deciding and acting. As they began to teach people this way of thinking about bringing values and other elements into their work, they were criticized by other entities, and the Australians had developed a different model and advocated for what they called the ASDA loop, ASDA, act, sense, decide, and adapt. And what this means is, they're recognizing that, in especially in military context, but in life generally, people are always in some sense having to make decisions, having to get something done before they actually have time to observe and orient. So there's a way in which important decision-making starts from a moment of action, actually. But then as you act, you need to follow that up with diagnosis, really understand the consequences for the lived outcomes from your action, make judgments about that and adapt. So the point is that there's a kind of adaptation principle that is really important to bringing values into connection with concrete actions and concrete policies. So it really is an iterative process, a constant adaptation and working again on issues of alignment. So I try to capture this by encouraging people to think about 5 components in the work of bringing values in relationship to real change. There are the question of what values you have, how you're diagnosing the problems to be solved, the prescriptions, the action strategies that you'll develop, but then also real attention to the lived outcomes that flow from those action strategies and the readiness to bring those back into consideration in relationship to values in order to support adaptation and changing direction, okay? But to the point I was saying before, and to the point of the military example, a person can start this cycle from any place on it. So I'm a philosopher. I happen to start from working on values. That's just what I do. That's the business that I'm in. Bruce is a social scientist. He starts from diagnosis without even necessarily, obviously values are infusing what he's choosing to work on, but social science, I'm going to caricature you a little bit, Bruce, I apologize, but has trained him just to go ahead and start from diagnosis without necessarily taking a lot of time to stop and think about values. And so what this cycle does is help people ask the question of which part of the cycle is my sort of sweet spot or the place that I'm residing, and how do I make sure I connect to the other parts of the cycle? So if I'm a social scientist, how do I find the moments where I make space for thinking about values? If I'm dealing with the lived outcomes of policies other people have imposed, how do I find the way to get back upstream and start changing those action strategies? How do I make sure that I can bring other people who are affecting those policies into conversations around values? That's part of the work, and that's hard. And so then this is a sort of silly chart that came out of a workshop. I was just trying to help people recognize that different parts, different roles in our society have kind of taken ownership of different aspects of this cycle. And so one of the challenges of really driving transformation and putting values together with policy is about building partnerships across different role categories. So who works on values officially? Well, philosophers do, so do people in the domain of religion, Pastor Mike, for example, Reverend Nixon, also people in the domain of culture, movie makers, authors, etc., artists. Who works on diagnosis routinely? All of our positive social scientist friends, but protesters do too. That's what protesters are always doing, is diagnosing things that are wrong. Who works on prescriptions? Policymakers, lawyers, a lot. I mean, the prescription space is really flooded with lawyers. And then that matters because you get a certain kind of category of prescription if lawyers own that space, and economists also have a fair chunk of territory in that space. And so sometimes you have to figure out how to make room for other people in the prescription space. Action strategy, politics, advocates, community organizers, they tend to own that space. And then citizens, people in the community own the lived outcomes space. And one of the problems is that often experts in one of these spaces just plain don't pay attention to experts in the other space. So you all know this from your experience, for sure. I was really struck by a friend who's an economist in the economics department at Harvard, who after the 2016 election, he was reflecting on the impact of globalization on the politics of the country and the way globalization had caused damage to a lot of communities as jobs left, especially the Rust Belt area, some of the more rural parts of the country and the like. And he said, my colleagues and I, we always knew that globalization would be a 20-year process to completely work its way through our economic system. But I only have just now realized I never stopped to consider what 20 years feels like in the life of a person living through it. Okay. And that was just for me a really powerful moment because it captured the way in which academic research is often just so badly separated from lived outcomes. And the point of the cycle I'm trying to describe here is to suggest to people that nobody's work is complete unless it has touched on all 5 of these dimensions, and that academic researchers need to recognize that they are responsible for the values part of the conversation. They are responsible for the lived outcomes part of the conversation, et cetera. So how does this all relate to justice reform? I mean, here are some of the diagnostics that you're all familiar with, we're all familiar with. I'll just, remind you of, these are just, small empirical snapshots of the world that we currently live in, and none of this is new to any of you. Growth in income inequality, which in its rate of increase and timetable coincides, of course, with the growth in incarceration. And then the fact that, of course, there are incredible racial disparities aligned with all of that growth. Again, none of this is news. And that as incarceration grew and got more intense, it ultimately reached everybody, so that in the first decade of the 2000s, white women saw the greatest rate of increase in incarceration, just important to remember. So when we have a set of diagnostics like that, I mean, I think a lot of people have come into the issue of thinking about our criminal legal system from that space of diagnosis, just registering things that are wrong, or in the space of lived outcomes, feeling the damage in communities. That's certainly my own experience, was just feeling the damage in the community around me. And so then the question is, having had those lived outcomes, that experience, seeing the diagnostics starting to emerge, can we clarify the values that are activating our powerful sense that something is profoundly wrong? And that's the work you've all been doing, that Square One has been doing over many years, and has reached an incredibly powerful cumulative point. And so then, having done that, right, there's an opportunity to come back to prescriptions and action strategies. So I think of the work that has been underway in the Square One context as really, in such an important way, growing out of this 2015 report from Jeremy and Bruce that you all know, where the group reviews all the different causes and consequences of the rise of incarceration. And then in the famous chapter 12 says, not only are there all of these empirical things that we have to consider, but there's this other issue, which is that in the domain of justice, empirical evidence by itself cannot point the way to policy. Yet an explicit and transparent expression of normative principles has been notably missing as US incarceration rates dramatically rose over the past 4 decades. Normative principles have deep roots in jurisprudence and theories of governance, and are needed to supplement empirical evidence to guide future policy and research. From my point of view, this is a transformative moment, the moment when there's a really important public statement about the necessity of doing work on values and principles if we're ever going to transform the legal system, the justice system. And of course, the team that produced this report started that work in that document, and tried to focus on some principles that were sort of pertinent to the justice system as we've known it. But the conversation has continued. And so we've really had the chance to dig into the question of what values should anchor a new effort at prescriptions and action strategies. And as you all know, the place that I think we've started to land is to recognize that the concepts of public safety and well-being, safety and happiness, the general welfare, are really emerging to the top of our conversations as the ones that deserve our attention, that we've had distorted definitions of public safety, definitions that have depended too much on counting crime rates, that have been racialized and in ways that entrench racial domination, and that have left out the safety and well-being of communities of color and communities of lower socioeconomic resources and unhoused communities over time. So a lot of work, as you all know, you've all contributed, has gone into rebuilding these core concepts, giving ourselves a set of new anchoring definitions. And we can go back to those diagnostics that I showed you, the missing Black men, the incarceration rates and so forth. And every single one of those diagnostics can be explained in terms of a failure in relationship to values of these kinds. But so then the question comes, okay, now if we're clear about our anchoring values and we're clear how they help us understand what's wrong with what we've lived through, how do we get to the prescriptions and the action strategies? And so, we have been working with a big network. Many of you have been participating, and we've been trying to flesh out the components of principles that could help us think about how to clarify which policies are the most valuable ones. And I shared a draft document in advance with you. Many of you on this call have contributed to it. It's still very much in progress, but I just wanted to call out a little bit of the text from it to give you a sense of what we're doing, what we're saying. Oops, sorry. Now, of course, my Zoom screen is slightly blocking the text, and so I can't read it. So I'm going to just quickly go ahead and read it this way. A just system of justice and public safety starts from recognition of basic human worth, achieves a movement from a desire for retribution to a commitment to repair and healing, and develops human-centered concepts of accountability capable of delivering well-being and safety for all. This undertaking depends on pursuing the following 7 human goods: relational health and community health, freedom from domination, self-determination, participation, economic dignity and security, data transparency, and recognition and redress of past state harm. A new foundation for justice, as embodied in our systems of public safety and sanction for wrongdoing, will flow from focusing on the 7 human goods above and the principles for policymaking that follow from them. There may also be other goods that we have not yet identified, but this new foundation, the hypothesis is, will deliver well-being and safety to all. Now, there's a lot still to be debated in these terms and in these definitions. And in the document that I shared with you, there is sort of a paragraph articulating the kind of policy principle that would flow from each of these 7 human goods. And we really welcome your feedback and engagement on them. But so the question then, of course, is how do you get from this picture of a set of principles to operationalizing them? And again, taking that to be both in the terms of thinking about metrics, in terms of thinking about politics, and policies rather, and then in terms of bringing new policies into reality in concrete contexts. So here, I'm gonna just say something about the ambition of the effort, the ambition of the cause of abolition and of justice reform, and encourage everybody to be ambitious, but also recognize that the ambition of comprehensive transformation requires partnership. So, it requires, just as on that chart that I showed you with the sort of different roles people are playing, it requires people working from different roles to do different parts of the work of building a new paradigm and getting it into place. And so the elements of getting a new paradigm into place, I think, and this comes out of work with other colleagues as well, depend on clarity about the normative foundations for the new paradigm. That's the second box there. So sort of level 1 element, that's the deepest level of change. And that's really what you've been working on with the values conversation. It requires a policy model that really brings those values to life. That's level 2. Then you also need emblematic policies, sort of concrete examples of policies that count as realizing the values. And they need to be emblematic because that also helps teach people how to make policy and build organizational practices that align with the values. You need key metrics, that should say level 4. Sorry, that's missing. And you also need vernacular narratives, level 5, ordinary ways of talking about this paradigm, how the pieces fit together. So I'm going to give you some examples that come out of the world of political economy and then bring it back to the question of justice, okay? So these are old paradigms, 2 very old paradigms, and one we're still living in, but many of us hope will become an old paradigm. So three paradigms of political economy. Okay, classical liberalism really dates to the late 18th and 19th century. Keynesian social democracy from the first half of the 20th century, and neoliberalism, which is the kind of political economy we've all been living with for the last 40 years. And each of these paradigms, each of these sort of systematic ways of organizing the world has a set of normative foundations. So in classical liberalism, for example, the things that are really valued are order and rule, liberty, autonomy, a sort of anti-paternalistic approach to policy. Whereas in Keynesian social democracy, which is sort of early 20th century product and then really built up in post-war Britain, the anchor values are things like solidarity and security and fairness. In the world of neoliberalism that we've all been living in, the anchor values have been things like freedom and procedural justice. And these anchor values are connected to very different policy models. So if you go to the fourth column, go back to classical liberalism, and the policy model is one in which the division of labor and specialization in competitive markets really take precedence. That's what people focus on. In contrast, in the Keynesian moment, there's a real focus on the economic concepts of aggregate demand, solidarity wages, so investing in wages for the sake of supporting social solidarity. And then in our most recent period, the policy model has depended on concepts of self-interest, the notion that you're really just structuring incentives to activate self-interest. And again, competitive markets have come back to the fore. And each of these policy models has then had emblematic policies, okay? So for classical liberalism, free trade, anti-monopoly work, a complementarity between state-provided infrastructure and private investment. Whereas in the Keynesian world of sort of welfare state, there's been an emphasis on tax and transfer, public goods redistribution, and egalitarian supply side policies. And for neoliberalism, laissez-faire, school vouchers, and negative income tax. Now that's all very technical, right? That's the sort of the language of the people who own the policy making landscape of economists and lawyers. But the reason the paradigms really take is because they also come to have vernacular narratives, folk ways of capturing the core ideas. And so in the last column, in classical liberalism, the famous statement from Adam Smith, it's not the benevolence of the, sorry, I should say the butcher, the brewer, the baker. It's not from their benevolence that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest, okay? That was a kind of common catchphrase that captured these ideas from classical liberalism. Whereas in the Keynesian context, the vernacular narratives that emerged are things like well-paid workers sustain demand in the economy, and that savings is prudent for a family, but not for a government when the economy is in recession. And then more recently, for the neoliberalism paradigm, ideas like that the government that governs best governs least, that labor unions are nothing other than special interest groups, that there's no such thing as society and you get what you pay for. Okay, so those kind of very common phrases actually catch a whole paradigm that's been built up through, again, work on values actually, plus work on policies, plus emblematic policies. All right, so where could we go? I hope collectively that we can go to something that is about shrinking the footprint of capitalism or right-sizing capitalism, you could think about it as. So the first row there is an emerging paradigm for political economy. It's actually exactly the paradigm that we are seeing emergent in Biden's infrastructure policy. His infrastructure policy is a really good example of what has been emerging in the last sort of 5 to 8 years in work done by people in political economy. And then the second row is a set of suggestions for how the components of a new paradigm for justice could potentially come together. It's just a sort of first pass set of thinking. But so let me just run through the political economy row, and then I'll do the justice row, and then we'll be about ready to switch over to conversation. So The normative foundations of this new approach to the economy focus on the value of non-domination in the first instance, or undominated social relations, on the value of voice, that is, of empowering people to set directions for themselves, and on the value of sustainability. And the policy model that is connected to this recognizes the place of identity in economics, the fact that what people want in the world is not just a matter of what economists call utility or sort of basic self-interest, but also depends on their communities and their understanding of the good that comes from the communities they're members of. A lot of focus on networks and things called mechanism design. Come back to that. But so what are some emblematic policies in this space? Wealth distribution to support inclusive innovation, workplace rights and voice, for example, and competition for the market. That is, not letting corporations define the market, but insisting that the power of political institutions should actually help structure the market so that the market's working in the interests of everybody. And so what are some vernacular narratives that have come into being? One is that cooperation works, and that there's complementarity between moral sentiments, again, the things that we care about coming out of our communities, and our material interests. So in the space of justice on the bottom line, the same sorts of anchor values, I think, are coming out in the conversations we're all having about dignity and voice and health in communities. So those are the terms roughly identified there. And the policy model is one that really elevates lived experience policymaking. Iterative co-design, that's kind of what we were talking about before with nonprofits and academic researchers working together. This policy model emphasizes public health models, network social effects, power sharing, intersectional identities, and democracy tools as justice tools. And so here's a just completely preliminary set of emblematic policies that would represent this model: demilitarized policing, de-escalation as standard element of police protocol, shifts of budget from policing to violence prevention and health services, credible messenger programs, no pretrial detention, cash bail, and system of alternatives to incarceration. And so what are some vernacular narratives that capture this paradigm? Human beings are fundamentally social. There's no excuse for wanton police violence. The biggest obstacle to successful reentry is incarceration itself. Our job is the politics of care. We're building a school to voting booth pipeline. Get our people healthy. Those are just sentences that I've heard in conversations like these in Square One workshops and other contexts that capture, I think, the direction that people are trying to work on. So hold on a second, sorry. I'm gonna, this is a slightly longer list of those example emblematic policies. And if I could wave a magic wand, I would love to just sort of crowdsource everybody's sort of favorite example of a policy that moves us in the direction of the kinds of values articulated by those 7 principles I started out with. That's the first critical step in terms of how you operationalize values, is you actually find concrete examples, whether in the world or in a sort of space of imagination and solution proposal that count as examples of those policies. And you also then begin to find ordinary language and vocabulary for talking about why these emblematic policies are so valuable. And the package put together starts to teach people, decision makers in all kinds of levels, as well as public opinion, in ways that can drive transformation. So there's more to be said here. There's some things I'm hoping to say about metrics too, but I will save that for part 2. And just pause here for now to let people digest and respond and talk. I know that was a lot.
No, Danielle, thank you so much for walking us through that, for all of those thoughts. And as you were talking, I was sort of hearing
in my head, you know, the conversation that started last night with, for example, Marlon saying, what if we organized everything around forgiveness? And then we spent time earlier today kind of moving through the steps on your circle of like, if that's a value, then what does that look like in at these different points around the circle? How do we think about that as we diagnose? In the point of diagnosis, what are our prescriptions, what are our actions, but then what are the lived experiences that then brought us back around to like, wait, what about that value? And it's just really, really telling, really powerful how this can help us structure our thinking. So I want to open it up for folks. Danielle prompted us with a question there at the end of what are some of the examples of policies, but so feel free to answer that question, but also invite folks' reactions and thoughts to this, and we will do our usual hand raising with the availability of the urgent wave for anyone who needs it at any point. We are going to try to turn back to Danielle in about half an hour so that we can get a little bit more information from her on the table. And so I'll ask folks to try to be a little bit brief in your comments just so we make sure we have time to for anyone who wants to have a moment to speak. So let's see, we have a raised hand. Donna, go ahead.
Sorry, I was trying to unmute. I really like the framework, this circle that you have shared with us. But as I was examining it, I was wondering, it looked to me as if it were not at all linear in this fashion, that actually many of these things inform and also constrain many of the other things on that circle. And is that something that you or we are like exploring further?
I mean, it's definitely not linear. However, I think, so the reason I go ahead and leave it in a circle that looks linear is as a kind of a mode of discipline, really, so that people remind themselves, what am I doing on values? What am I doing on diagnosis? What am I doing on prescription? And stop at every moment to figure out which is the piece of this that I'm still weak on. Right. So you sometimes you might need to jump from values to prescription. You may have done tons of work on diagnosis and it's time to sort of go from values to prescription. So it's more a matter of making sure that one's always sort of thinking about how those 5 moments connect to each other, and making sure also that the different people who have resources to bring to bear for each of the 5 are participating. Right. Because I mean, that's part of the challenge, is that none of us can actually cover that whole circle ourselves in isolation. It's always about partnership. And sometimes I think just remembering to ask, do we have all the resources we need for each of those 5 points is important to getting the work done. And it's also okay to go backwards. You don't always have to go forwards. You go values, diagnosis, values, diagnosis, values, diagnosis before you sort of start moving on to prescriptions as well. I've seen different groups do all kinds of things with that sort of circle, basically.
Nicole, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say that there is, there's been a growing movement within sociology as a discipline that has been challenging some of the ideas that social scientists shouldn't be driven by values and ethics. And so back in 1967, Howie Becker had asked the question, whose side are we on? And in this, kind of important article, what he was trying to say is he was writing at a time of civil rights and Vietnam War and widespread social change. And he challenged us to think about whether objectivity and value neutrality, like whether we could be neutral, and that we should in some ways pick a side. And, I was talking, we were doing a book discussion on the new book, The Torture Letters, and by Professor Lawrence. Mm-hmm. And, I offered him that question, and he said back to me, I gave him a softball, and he said, if we have to be neutral on torture, we're really in a bad place here. And, I couldn't agree more, which is, early in the pandemic when everything shut down, I put some of this text. I wrote an article for Context, which is our magazine in sociology. And I wrote this in my book, Kirk County, our pursuit of objectivity and our research scares us into incorporating considerations of compassion, morality, humanity, and grace into our research, despite the overwhelming evidence that it may be the antidote for the pain and loss we are experiencing in this moment. And then I basically at the end of the article say, if there's anything called sociological malpractice, but insert whatever social science it is, it would be noticing and measuring inequality, and then, you know, raising your hands and saying there's nothing I can do for it. And so, you know, I would even, as a social scientist, I would even go farther and say, when can we call it malpractice? And this is in addition to research that causes harm, which we talked about in the last session. So it's not just the I'm neutral, which I think is a form of complicity, but it is research that actually causes harm. And so I'd love to hear your perspective on harm creation, and that we also have the capacity to create harm, either by doing nothing or sometimes doing something.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's where, for me, the lived outcomes piece is so important, right? That is, it's not enough to just sort of do your piece of research and leave it at that. You need to actually be connected with people who have more understanding of lived outcomes of that flow from that research or that policy development and the like. And it's also not about one-off conversation. I mean, that's where I do think one of the most important things coming out of the Square One conversation, and not just, I mean, many other sites too, is this point about co-design, right? Co-design of research, co-design of policy. So, you know, that was one of those, what's the policy paradigm that's emerging right now as we do this work together? It's a co-design paradigm. That's very different approach to policy making than has been in place really, you know, ever probably. And it's important to recognize that that sort of different approach to research and to policymaking itself flows out of values, right? It's a sort of recognition that if we are trying to move towards securing well-being for all, the only sound foundation for doing that epistemologically is one that includes all who are affected by the research and the policy in setting the direction for it. So the first value is the well-being and flourishing for all. And that, you know, those are small words for all. They capture inclusion plainly. They also capture an end to racial domination, an end to white supremacy and the like. And so sometimes, you know, we've got to say that explicitly too. The words for all don't necessarily speak all of that to everybody. But the point is that that commitment, that values commitment to well-being for all is a fundamental commitment and a new commitment in the sense that, you know, basically the world is just too full of too many times and places where people have accepted a status quo of domination and exclusion, right? So in that regard, you know, once you do truly embrace the for all words in all the depth of their meaning, a lot of other things have to change. And that's what we are really naming, I think, across this conversation, is all the other things that have to change once you take the for all words seriously.
Jeremy, did you want to jump in with a question?
Yeah, if I could. Oh, I see other hands up. Just if I could quickly, Danielle, in our Square One discussions, we've mentioned two other realities, and I wonder how they fit into your, you know, your really elegant schematic here. One is the importance of organizing to bring about a change that would be aligned with a different set of values, and how, as you look at these three different frameworks that you put up there, I'm not sure whether any of them were accomplished, those shifts, through organizing. So what brings the shift about? And the related flip side of that is we've talked a lot about power sharing and demands for change by people in power. And if there are deeply entrenched interests, which there are in the status quo, what's it going to take, basically, to change that power dynamic, the status quo, basically? So organizing and prospect for change, given the status quo.
Yeah, if we double click on action strategies, right, that takes us into that whole conversation. And absolutely, I mean, organizing is a part of the answer. Another part of the answer is just, you know, it's power mapping, but a related piece with that is also just systems mapping. So we were talking about this in our breakout group earlier, which is, we, in this country in particular, we have a really unusual level of complexity in our jurisdictional structures with all the layers of our federal system. And then even at the local level, you've got city governments, you've got county governments, you've got other kinds of regional governments, et cetera. And then they're all working in a context of a sort of state government where all the different state governments they're all completely different, basically. I was doing pandemic work and interviewing somebody in Illinois coming out of public health context who said to me, if you've seen public health infrastructure in one state, you've seen public health infrastructure in one state. And that's sort of, roughly speaking, exactly the same thing with our justice system. So nonetheless, and that's why I actually do think starting locally is so important, because at the end of the day, we can't actually answer from the top what will work, precisely because like the channels like from the top down to locality are just so different. Like it's an almost infinite array of possibilities. So what you really do have to do is figure out at the local level, what could work in our community? What do we want to build in our community? And then ask the questions. I was saying to Abby earlier, well, given that this is what we want at the local level, what do we need at the state level to make that possible? What do we need at the federal level to make that possible? If we ask the questions in that order, then you can start to see very clearly like who the stakeholders are, because they're like limited to your more limited local area in the first instance, but then there's a very clear line from that to articulating what you need at the level of the state. And then that becomes a very kind of clear line of action. So yes, you need organizing, and that's sort of on 3 dimensions: organizing at the local level, which Abby's doing. And I hope we could talk about that work because it sounds like everybody should hear about it. And then organizing that takes the learnings from that and applies it to driving change at the state level, driving change at the federal level. Right. But I would say like in that order, whereas very often we go the other way around, we sort of we think we need to organize from the federal level first. I think it really is important to go from this level up, but to have people like working together. So, just one last thing to say there, I made reference to the educational policy landscape previously. And when people are trying to drive change in that, I mean, what they do is set up, big coalitions. And they'll have one chunk of folks like working on state policy advocacy, another chunk working on federal policy advocacy, but making sure that that's aligned. And it's, different models at different points in time, but currently, that alignment is driven by views from a local level about what's needed by way of resources, changes to regulations or policies or mandates and the like at the state and the federal level.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. It's really interesting, just thinking about what Pastor Mike was talking about a little while ago and the way in which, sort of identifying the federal lever of billions and billions of dollars and then doing the local organizing and bringing the local perspective to bear on that so that it then can be driven back down to the local level. Like that's just such a brilliant work on the part of the advocates and organizers who've put that model together. Marcia, your hand is raised.
Thank you, Danielle. I really appreciated I'm an audiovisual learner, and definitely the layout was very, very helpful. I think the 2 things that came up for me as I was listening to you, and I'll have to spend some time. I've been doing a lot of self-care lately, so haven't really delved deep into some of the materials that were sent. 2 things that came up for me is, when we have these definitions of well-being, I often have to ask myself, what is the definition of those things, or even medical models, right? Because I ask the question of, are we coming from a colonized thinking of these things or decolonized place? So even structures, right? These structures that we develop, are they coming from a decolonized place? Because for brown folk or indigenous folk that are not even seen, right? So when we looked at the data that you presented, I had to ask, are brown folks, Latinos or indigenous people in the white category, or in what category are they? Because otherwise we're not even shown in the data. So then we go to the next question, which is, okay, does these structures, are you talking about, when we say everybody, it's like really everybody, or is it, because in honoring that people come at these things with different values, then where does that live? Because I know that especially, I've been around reform work forever, for 25 years, especially on the youth side. And I agree with you that starting at a local level, not only is that the function of changing these things by closing down systems is best it has to be done at a local level and then scaled up to state. But second, most importantly, is that's where you really, the uniqueness of each community gets to live, right? And so anyway, those were some comments and questions about, you know, coming from decolonized places, how do we trust, you know, that these schemes, that these diagrams, that these philosophies and ways of thinking actually include some of the values of people that are normally not seen.
Right. I want to share something again real fast. Just go back here. And this is only partial. But so the short answer is yes, I think for the first time we have decolonized foundations to work from. And does that mean that they have no flaws? No, I'm sure it doesn't, because everybody in some ways will, I think almost inevitably, produce acts of domination that other people need to critique them for, that need to be undone. So no, nothing's perfect, but I do think, again, for the first time, we are actually working with decolonized intellectual foundations. So this is a small point, but if I were running down the whole column here, the third column from all the other models previously, like if I went back to this red slide, let me go back to the previous slide. Okay, everybody in this column is white, and I think, yeah, everybody here is also a man, okay? So in other words, that our intellectual foundations, our normative foundations have absolutely been exclusionary and dominating for sure. And this square here is half people of color in this square. And it's not even a complete list of everybody, obviously, who's making the critical difference here. So the point is just that we do, for the first time in philosophy, okay, this sounds kind of crazy. This seems like it doesn't necessarily, most people think philosophy doesn't matter, but nonetheless, for the first time in the history of the world, okay, we actually have a huge body of really impactful philosophy being produced by people of color and recognized by others. People of color have produced philosophy for a long time, and including in even formal categories and spaces, in addition to the many ways in which cultures have been producing philosophy for a long time. But in terms of the intersection of the production of philosophy with institutional structures and decision-making and the like, for the first time, we do have decolonized intellectual foundations flowing into the work and into the process. So for the specifics of definitions of well-being coming out of this work, I mean, the definitions come from concepts of non-domination. That is, you have to start from that, and people need to be able to participate in shaping the definitions of well-being. So the sort of process of decolonized power relations is actually brought into the definition of well-being here. So that's just, you know, a small answer to your very important big question.
We have a quick insistent wave from Nicole, and then we're going to have time. I think we'll have, John has one more question comment to raise, and Danielle, then we'll turn to you for a response, and we can turn to the next part of our conversation if that works for everybody. So Nicole, why don't you go ahead quickly?
Yeah, this is just a quick shout out though, but I guess, and just to this larger point, Black feminist scholars, for instance, have been doing value-based work in the social sciences for a long time. Yeah. They have often been pushed out into gender studies or AFAM or Black studies rather than getting tenure in sociology departments. I mean, we have to put this out there. So I just, you know, I know, you know, it sounds like philosophy has the same problem, but I just want to make sure that, you know, there's this undercurrent of Black criminologists, or I would say Black sociologists, critical race scholars, certainly, that do not remove values from this. They include narrative. And that's, you know, this, I think we need to say that, because even just saying that the generalization that sociologists or social scientists don't have value-based, that I would just, you have to say the word white. before that, because this has been done. Angela Davis, Dorothy Roberts, Kim Crenshaw. I mean, there's so many. So I just want to put that, I have to give them a shout out because they've been doing it right. And it would probably just obscure their work if we didn't put that big caveat in the front of the presentation. So
100%, 100%. And I should say, when I say it's our first time in the world, because embarrassing, I think in like millennia length scales.
Yeah.
So I'm not just talking, I don't mean now, I don't mean 2021. I do mean, in this last period of time, and I am thinking about people like Angela Davis and Kimberly Crenshaw as well. And of course, I'm also thinking about Du Bois and Fanon and so forth. So there's
Du Bois. Hello.
There's an arc of this, right, over the last century. But it's building to a point of transforming the core. I think that's the additional point. That is a change from where we were when Du Bois was.
Right. And if Du Bois was giving his due credit, maybe social science would look very different. If he wasn't sent off from Penn and, we would have centered a Du Boisian sociology to be sociology, we would have exactly what we need for this moment. But that didn't happen.
Right. Yeah.
Great. John, why don't you jump in here and then.
Just briefly, I love this project and I'm very much closely following it. I found this really helpful, the table, and I just had a thought I wanted to pin around it, which is that if you think about neoliberal political economy in terms of the vernacular narratives, I would say and not in a conspiratorial sense, but the progenitors of that recognize the synergies between political economy and criminal justice and embraced it. I mean, Gary Becker wrote an influential article about crime from an economic perspective. The whole idea of prices, remember the era of use a gun, go to prison, or 10, 20 life, that you're really setting out a price signal. And it had enormous appeal as recently as a quarter century ago. Since we're in New York, figuratively speaking, I brings my memory to visiting at NYU in '96 when Giuliani was being crowned for a second term, and sort of neoliberal New York was in glory and seemingly winning its war on crime at the same time. Very different moment now. But I wonder if we need to think about how to make the vernacular of shrinking capitalism more integrated with a vision of the transformation of the penal state. I mean, neoliberalism was very good at seeing that, leveraging that connection, the dissatisfactions with that.
Yeah, no, I think that is right. And I hope that the conversation that's underway here could help achieve that. I mean, I think the folks working under this heading of shrinking capitalism are in their own early stages of understanding how the work they're doing in a political economy space connects to other domains. So I have shared some of the sort of justice work with them in the hopes that that their own interest in non-domination, they could come to see the justice realm as being one where working that idea through here too is really, really important. So I think there's a lot of potential. And I think, to the point some of us were talking about earlier, lots of the things, when we imagine a world without prisons, when we imagine a different world here, one of the things we need in order to succeed in terms of addressing violence when it does emerge and the like is strong social services, right? Sort of strong economic foundations for people, strong health foundations for people, and so forth. And you don't get any of that without a political economy that's delivering that, right? So these things really are hand in glove with each other. But if you look at, I know everybody's looked at the Biden infrastructure bill, right? But and you've seen the debate about the definitions of infrastructure, right? This question, is only hard infrastructure what gets to count as infrastructure, or is everything else infrastructure? That debate is the debate between the neoliberal paradigm and this new paradigm, that the shrinking capitalism paradigm. That is exactly it. Like that, these are the paradigms fighting with each other right now, and we should all hope that the new paradigm, the economy of care and the like, wins.
Danielle, why don't we, I'll turn to you if you want to share the next part of your presentation, and then we can return to conversation. That would be terrific.
Sure. Okay. No, glad to. And so this now, I'm going to share something that's going to feel really small bore. So I apologize for that. It's going to feel so inadequate to the moment and to the work that you are all trying to do. So I just want to apologize for that up front. But this is just focused on the metrics piece and the importance of, you know, of rethinking what we're measuring. And again, I know you all know the importance of that, but I just wanted to walk you through one example where that kind of work was really fundamental to transforming organizational practice. Okay, and so this does not come from the space of justice reform. It comes from work on diversity and inclusion, or inclusion and belonging in the university context. So forgive me for the self-referential example. Okay. So a few years ago, I co-chaired a task force at Harvard on inclusion and belonging. And as you know, every university is trying to figure this out. And we did proceed in a fashion similar to what I articulated here, with working through values, diagnosis, prescription, action strategies, lived outcomes, and the like. So as we did this work on a task force, we literally started by working on a value statement, and we also worked on empirical diagnosis, and we did those things in parallel with each other. So, you know, the university had a habit of collecting inclusion and belonging data, and so of course we sort of gathered what existed, but as we worked on our value statement, we also realized that we cared about stuff that the university hadn't been tracking in its data. So we would then, you know, adjust what we were asking for from a research perspective, and in various ways had to start doing some new research in order to be able to actually tell, you know, how things were going in relationship to the values that we were articulating. So then once we'd done that work and had settled on some newly formulated goals, we also sought to identify supporting factors for those goals. So, you know, what do you need to see upstream in terms of norms, in terms of practices, in terms of organizational structures, in order to get the outcomes that are your goals. And so then once we had those goals and some clarity about, you know, in effect, hypotheses about supporting factors, we combed the existing literature for measurement constructs that could be used to trace both the supporting factors and the goals. And again, because there was nothing out there that had exactly the sort of survey shape or research shape of what we were now interested in. So we were sort of cherry picking from a variety of different kinds of studies for those specific metrics, measurements, constructs that actually did align with what we were looking for, and trying to start building new instruments. We did the same thing around practices and policy ideas. We just looked, and this is like that exemplary policies point that I made. We just looked for anything anybody was doing that looked like it counted as an example of the goals that we had. And we tried to gather those all up into one place in order to start having a picture of what a whole set of things you might do would look like. And then of course, we wanted to develop tools to measure alignment between lived outcomes that might flow from these new practices and policies with the goals. With regard to action strategies, we did do the work of mapping the stakeholders who had a role in operationalizing the pertinent policies and recommendations, and we developed political strategies in relationship to each. So obviously the scale of a university is a heck of a lot smaller than the scale of the country. This is what I mean about this not exactly being a useful example, but the actions are the same. You just need like a much bigger body of coordinating people to do it more broadly. But just to focus on the first part, the metrics, just to make this really concrete. So, so from step 1 to step 2, how did we go from values clarification to starting to have tools to operationalize things? This was the language from the statement we used just actually ultimately internally to shape our work. We had a slightly different version of it in the final document, but Harvard's motto is Veritas, or truth. In all things, we strive toward truth and academic excellence. Toward that end, our campus community recognizes each person's inherent dignity, strives to foster each person's potential, and promotes the bonds and bridges that allow us to support each other, to grow with each other, and to learn from each other, including through disagreement. If we succeed in cultivating and sustaining such a campus, members of the university, regardless of background, identity, and role, so we really want to include staff who'd always been left out before in this work on inclusion and belonging. So regardless of background, identity, and role, will enjoy full and genuine membership in our community. Each will have an ownership stake. It will ring true to say we are all Harvard. And because membership entails not only rights, but also responsibilities, our success requires that each of us understands how we contribute to crafting this community, to supporting academic excellence, to fostering individual well-being, and to respecting each other's dignity and contributions. So we ended up boiling that down into wanting to have the outcomes of academic achievement for all. In other words, everybody came to campus with a certain set of academic goals, and everybody deserved to be able to achieve in relationship to the goals they came with. Satisfying professional development, that making sure we were including staff in that picture of development and well-being, and a sense of belonging. Those were sort of three overarching goals. We thought that supporting factors involved academic and social integration, knowledge and skill development, support and motivation, and monitoring and advising. So, it gets pretty granular pretty quickly. And so we then did the work I just described of combing through literature to find constructs. We looked at a whole lot of diversity and inclusion surveys from a lot of different universities and didn't find any that actually aligned with the values that we had laid out. Lots of people had pieces and parts because everybody's sort of working in a similar space, but nobody had really boiled down the values and really kind of concentrated their measurement around those values. So we combed through everything, gathered everything up, kind of organized it in terms of who was hitting which part of our values and goals, and then clarified for ourselves the kind of structure we wanted and started trying to boil it down. And after a long process, it's like ultimately a year and a half long process, we ended up with a 10-question survey that is now being used on a regular basis at Harvard to track how the community is doing. And so just to give you that, so these are the 10 questions we ended up with. I feel like I belong at Harvard. My relationships at Harvard are as satisfying as I would want them to be. I feel like I can be my authentic self at Harvard. The academic goals or professional goals I have for myself are being met at Harvard. I know what constitutes good performance in my role. I receive meaningful recognition for doing good work. I feel comfortable giving opinions and feedback to people at Harvard who have more decision-making authority than I do. I believe Harvard leadership will take appropriate action in response to incidents of harassment or discrimination. I have the knowledge to address hostile, harassing, or intimidating behavior that I witness. And please suggest 1 or 2 concrete actions that you believe would improve the climate for all members of the Harvard community. So 10 questions, very simple survey. It takes people 3 minutes to do. And for us, it really boiled down that values perspective that we started out with, and then gives us a way of holding the university to account over time for whether or not it is realizing those values in all the standard practices and protocols and actions taken every year. So that was a really small example, as I said, but I just wanted to show you, I wanted to be able to have one case where you could see the sort of the line of movement from the values statement to something as mundane as a 10-question survey that's being administered on a regular basis in an organization. So.
Thanks, Danielle. Thanks for that. Yeah, it really does. It's just hearkening back to our discussion about research and about what are we asking and about what we are measuring and all of that. I mean, it's obviously just right on point. I'll invite folks to raise your hands with comments or questions. You can ask questions of Danielle, but this is also our opportunity to talk amongst ourselves. So don't feel like that's the only way to engage the conversation. We encourage folks to share just what this prompts for you, what this brings up for you, thoughts and feedback you have generally. Monica, you want to jump in first?
Yeah, I will. I'm so grateful for that presentation. I found that to be really helpful. I wanted to know a little bit more about the process of moving from the values to the actual survey, because I think that could be just helpful for us thinking about metrics in these other contexts and like who's putting their hands in to develop them, and also how the data are analyzed would be helpful as well.
I have a long documentation memo that I can send you, so I will do that. But just in sort of shorter answer, I mean, it was a big group project. The first stage involved myself and several graduate student research assistants, a diverse group, diverse both in terms of personal background and in terms of department and discipline, and also reaching out. We also built a kind of advisory committee. So people like Jim Sedanius, who's a psychologist who works on issues of race and diversity, and a whole range of others. We had probably about 8 people from different departments around the university who were a kind of intellectual advisory group. And we really wrestled through the sort of logic model with them. And that was the sort of first step of it. And then what we actually ended up doing was taking a sort of structure for a survey and comparing the existing school surveys to it to show school leadership where we thought their surveys were not actually hitting the right targets from a values point of view. And then we had a stage where we were working with every school to try to help them bring their survey to a level of catching these key value areas. And then ultimately came to the conclusion that the most efficient thing to do would just be to actually add a survey that would be really short, but would unify the whole campus around something as opposed to having different surveys in different places. So the point of saying all that is just to say a lot of stakeholders were involved. So it didn't just go from research into, in use, it went through decision makers, it went through focus groups with students and staff and the like along the way. And each point along the way, we checked the values again. It's like the values themselves are always also being discussed as you're also kind of looking at whether or not the instrument realizes the values in a kind of authentic way.
Other thoughts, questions that folks might want to share?
Well, I'll just throw one little thing out, which is, I know a lot of people are working on, for example, making sure that things like police killings are reported in public health data, right? That we've had this problem of various kinds of state violence not counting from sort of public health metrics. And that, I think, is a very important, powerful project, and one that it would be good to bring to the surface for discussion and broad engagement in the question of those public health metrics and what should go in them that might facilitate movements in the directions we're all discussing.
Jeremy?
Yeah. 2 questions, Danielle. This is absolutely fascinating. We don't often see that trajectory from idea to formulation of a group, to think it through, to articulation of values, to a 10 question survey. So two very practical questions. If you look back on that critically, is there anything that you would do differently, looking at where you ended up, and just if you could give us some sense of what has changed at Harvard because of this. I'm assuming, without knowing, but there was some impetus for the creation of your committee. That, and it almost doesn't matter what it was, but you were created, but you were also there to address some issues. And has there been forward movement on something where you would say there's a plausible connection between this process and that change within the Harvard community?
I think one of the biggest changes has been the empowerment of people, both students and staff in particular, to say we are supposed to be at the decision-making table. Look, this says so, right? Even the survey says so, because it says, can I speak up to people with more authority than I have? And that's I think many things have changed, but probably the biggest thing is the number of just academic committees that now have students on them when they never did. Number of kind of faculty committees that now include lecturers when lecturers were not included previously. It was sort of limited to tenured faculty and the like. So there is a kind of spreading democratization of deliberative and decision-making context in the university. I think that's probably the biggest impact so far.
And anything you would do differently, Danielle?
Yes, so that's actually interesting. And it's funny because it relates to things I would do differently again in other contexts too. So I mentioned the sort of work with the different schools, trying to take their surveys to them and see if we could help them adjust their surveys. I think we actually tried in the beginning to produce sort of model surveys for each school. And that was a wasted effort ultimately, in the same way that I think sometimes when people try to produce a kind of model policy for like 50 different states, it's a wasted effort because the contexts are just so variable that what you really do need to give people is design principles. And the kind of combination of the goals and our short 10 question survey is much more powerful as sort of design principles than giving people a whole blueprint for what they should be doing.
Yeah, simplicity for the guideposts.
Yeah, exactly.
Great lesson.
Yeah. But making sure you have that measurement piece, right? Because if we just had the goals and not the survey, honestly, I think nothing would come from them. Okay. So it really matters that we made it to that simple survey that is in use at the end of the path.
You mentioned
Other
who
folks
had
have
access.
questions.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Sorry, did you mention who had access to the data?
You mean now with the survey that's in use or the previous data that we were working with?
Well, I guess all of the above, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. And, one of the things we struggled with in the work was discovering how limited access to data was. And we had to force access, at least for our group, to chunks of data that were off limits. And we did, in our overall recommendations, recommend data transparency and establishing a norm of that. This survey data is transparent, I believe. Actually, honestly, I have to admit, I've not been close to it for the last year, so I would have to go back and actually check, but it's supposed to be transparent and broadly accessible for use. I don't know how much progress we've made with the specific schools in terms of how well they're doing at the data transparency recommendation for their specific school-specific surveys.
Jump in with a question or comment? Yes, Bruce. Over to you.
This isn't specifically about the data piece, but includes it. This is also thinking about the whole model of sort of ethically guided problem solving that you've described. And I'm trying to bring your perspective and approach and the work you've done in conversation with how we were talking about it in the earlier part of the afternoon. Now, I've a bunch of thoughts there, but I want to pick up one piece here. And one thing that's sort of come up as a thread, and it came up in our breakout sessions, it came up last night too. So a lot of the work that people are doing around the table is very deeply ethically infused, and it continuously spills over into people's professional roles, and they're often thinking about their own moral journey in the work. And Anneka spoke about this earlier this afternoon, sort of reflecting on her own role running Cook County Jail, what place does that question have? Like the moral journey of the person doing the work in in this way of thinking about addressing and solving really big, hard, sort of not just policy problems, but problems, social problems in the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, funny you should ask. I have another framework for that. And let's see if I can find it easily or not. Let's see, I don't know if I can right now. Might have to send it to everybody afterwards.
Sounding like Elizabeth Warren, Danielle.
Exactly. I have a framework for that. The framework I have for that is called the 10 Questions for Young Changemakers. It's actually developed for young people. So no offense to all of you, but you can use it too. It's all right. And but it is exactly that question, Bruce. It's exactly about that journey of understanding what you care about and why, how to make choices about actually protecting yourself, because you also have to think about that too as you move toward situating your own action in the world. And then the question of how to move from what you care about and why, how to make it about more than yourself, how to make sure you're protecting yourself, to how to find allies, how to identify the action strategies that will help you take something that you want to give voice to something that you want to have influence over. So, I mean, the first part of the journey really is about that, reflection on what matters to you and why, and then clarifying the sort of choices you have in front of you for acting on what matters to you. And I think, for me, I also spend a lot of time when I do workshops with young people around that, well, all kinds of people, but we do talk a lot about the different roles that are available. Not everybody has to be, an activist, or not everybody has to be, a sort of hard charging reformer. There are lots of other ways also that you could make the difference in the world that matters to you. And to the point I was making originally with the circle, we really do need all kinds of expertise. So I often have kids in my office, right, wrestling with the question of whether or not they should be more or less an activist or a lawyer. That's kind of a common dilemma. And we need lawyers, right? Like, we need lawyers who are on the sides of activists. So yeah. I definitely want to encourage some of those kids to be lawyers, even if I'm also encouraging others of those kids to be activists. And so that's, an important thing, is that, you can do good work from across a whole variety of roles. And the question is, like, how do you get to do good work? That starts from that self-reflection about what matters to you and why, how you weigh questions of what you want to share. That's how we formulate the self-protection question. How much do I want to share? Why and with whom? And then the question of, once you're clear about those things, how you start building partnerships, finding allies, learning how to convert voice into influence. But I can't find it quickly right now. If I can find it, I'll send it to everybody. It used to have its own website. Somehow it seems to be buried under other things right now. So.
That's great.
Actually, here we go. This will give you some info anyway. Put it here.
Oh, great. Thanks. Okay, now I'm in the chat. Other thoughts and comments. I'm looking around the screen, and I know about the work that many of you all have done that that situates you possibly, at least on the surface, at particular points around the circle or in this work, but would love to hear folks' thoughts about how you see this potentially applying or not applying to the work that you're doing, or anything else you'd like to share. Oh, Abby. Over to you.
Great, thanks. Danielle, thank you. I haven't been in school in a very, very long time, and I felt really deep in the water, so thank you for this opportunity. Abby, listen. The circle is really helpful, and I was actually thinking about something that Daryl said last night. Thank you so much to Square One for recording that, because I was able to watch it before I hit the hay. Thank you, YouTube. That was fantastic. But how he talked about, and I mentioned this in the paper I wrote for the executive session on racial justice, but how law enforcement assisted diversion the outcomes are really showing that white people benefit. So just that generic criminal justice reform always benefits white people more than anybody else. And you have to really lean into that intentionality. That happened in Multnomah County. And now LEAD is taking a turn. It's turning into something different. It's really prioritizing folks who are struggling with addiction, homelessness, and prioritizing Black men for eligibility for all of the things, all of the good things. And I think if we had the values, the diagnosis, the prescription, the strategies, and the lived outcomes as a framework beforehand, that we could have understood what some of the challenges and problems were, and in an iterative space made some improvements before it kind of got a little crazy and, kind of took some time and energy to do that. So just thank you for the model and for helping me really cognitively have to check in this afternoon. That was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Abby. Other thoughts that folks have? Vivian, over to you.
Hi, Danielle, this was great. The conversations along the way were great too. I remember the day that the economist came and gave, I still want those slides. I think you might have sent them to me, but I lost them. So if you can send those,
I'll
not
resend them, sure.
yours too, but the definitely the ones that he did that day, they were like, my mind was blown.
I'll send those to you. Yeah, Sam's slides. Yeah.
But what I think about your line circle diagram is I have been really sitting here thinking of the numbers of areas of my life where that thinking pattern is helpful. It's unbelievable how almost in a way generic and simple it is, but yet so complex. So thank you for presenting this. I do think there is a possibility that we're moving into that 1, 2, 3, fourth column. Is it the fourth?
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if we'll ever get beyond that, but the way you chart it out makes it so simple to understand. And for me, this brings up a point that may or may not be relevant to this conversation, but I think is relevant to the whole Square One project, is that the hard work that academics do to come up with these ideas and theories to make the world a better place, or not, depending upon what you believe, whether or not that's the role of an academic. I think it should be. If they were just more accessible, like if more people could understand the outcomes of the research that you do in language that people really can relate to, I think whole communities would behave differently, would invest in their own lives differently, would access the power that they have differently. Which is why I really love the column that uses colloquialisms to match the theory. I think that more research should be presented in that way, so that it's more accessible to the public. And I'm just going to continue to follow you and try to be like you.
Well, Vivian, you know how much of your voice is in the work that we've been trying to do. And I hope you heard the combination of well-being and safety as a pair in that.
Yeah,
that's thanks
I
to
did.
you. So
Yeah, it's really great work. So thank you for sharing it with us.
No, thank you. I would love to brainstorm with you about the point you just made, because I think you're right. I was thinking about this after our breakout group earlier, because I said, I have this question I just can't answer for myself of why has it been so much harder to coordinate for nationally scaled up transformative action in the justice space than in other spaces? Though now it's occurred, it's happened thanks to the Movement for Black Lives and ELM specifically. So they've done it, and I mean, though there's still a lot of room to go in terms of achieving that kind of wholesale coordination. And I was just, after our breakout group, I was thinking about it, and I think the answer is just actually the one that you just said, Vivian, which is it's just the lack of representation of impacted people and communities of color in so many decision-making spaces, research spaces, and the like. So in the other areas I was mentioning, education issues, democracy reform, where I've seen just a kind of faster transition to really broad scale coordination, people are actually integrated into political representation, into academic contexts. And I think that's the answer to the failure of us to achieve the level of coordination we seek. So I think your point is a really deep one about, our work not being available to people, not being accessible to people. But I think that issue fundamentally is one of representation. So that brings me back to the need to figure out how to solve the representation problems in every dimension of our organizational structures.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
once people are at the table, they get the stuff, Like,
yeah, I mean, if it's presented in the right way, so because there are papers I read that I just, no matter how many times I read them, I could not articulate it that right. I think every research paper should be required to have one that you submit to the journal, and then a second, like, my research paper for the other people. Like here it is in regular language.
Right.
Yeah.
But by the same token, I mean, that is true. But I think, when you or somebody else is at a table with researchers, if the researcher is still, writing and communicating that way, like, 3 interactions down the road, then that's a real failure on the part of the researcher, right? So, having people at a table then actually is also how researchers learn how to do their own communicating differently.
Yeah. But it's a function too of how you get where you need to go as an academic. So I get it that you're trained in a certain way, and in order to move up that ladder, you got to do it.
Yeah, it's a deep point though, because there's just a deep, it's a deep blockage or obstacle to what we're all trying to do.
I think we see. Thank you, Vivian and Danielle.
Yes, John.
We have a couple more raised hands. If folks would like to get in the queue, I'm sensing we may finish a little early on this Friday afternoon, but folks should definitely jump in the queue if you have other questions or thoughts you'd like to raise. We'll hear from Susan and Donna and anyone else who raises a hand, and then Danielle will turn back to you for any closing thoughts you'd like to give, and then turn to Bruce. So with that, I will turn to, actually, let's see who was next. Susan, yes.
Thanks, Catherine. Thank you so much, Professor Allen. This is brilliant, wonderful, amazing. I can't wait to dig in more. I'm thinking the conversation that you and Reverend Nixon just had was really rich, and it's reminded me of when Ella Baker called all the students together to Shaw University to create SNCC, for them to create SNCC. She encouraged them to stay separate, right, from the SCLC. And she deliberately kept the Northern students out of the organizing conversations with the Southern students because of the ways that white supremacy had prevented, access to some of the things that the Northern students had. Now, remembering a story that Lawrence Guillot told me once about a Northern student who was really excited about Hegel, and he wanted to, talk to Guillot about Hegel, and Hegel's important. And Guillot said, listen, what I want you to do is go down to a street corner in Macomb, Mississippi, and I want you to talk about Hegel, and I want you to tell me how many community folks come talk to you. Mm-hmm. Fast forward, we were doing the Mississippi Truth Project, right?
I used to carry Hegel with me on airplanes so that people wouldn't talk to me. So.
That's awesome. Fast forward to when we were trying to, we tried really hard for a little while to create a truth commission in Mississippi. And we had we were doing oral histories, to help lift up people's stories. And we also had academics who were coming in to do research, right, to document patterns of abuse and that sort of thing. And we were really kind of more excited about the oral history, just because of those stories just haven't been told. And then there was this interesting meeting one day when a community member said, you have to privilege the academic stuff because the people in Jackson and the legislature don't care about our stories. They're only going to listen to the academics. The academics are going to be the ones that are legitimate. So I just want to lift those two stories up because there's such a need for that marriage, you know, to come together, for the bridge to be built, whatever the right metaphor is. And I think the conversation that you and Reverend Nixon just had and the work you're doing really points us in that way. And so I'm really appreciative.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Susan. I appreciate it. I think you've put it perfectly. I think that's exactly right. And figuring out how to build that bridge and how to make space for it so that people know they need it. Those are the key things. I mean, by people who need to know they need it, I mean the legislators who don't know they need it, but they do need it to do their jobs better. Yeah, they do.
Or need to be different legislators.
That's the other solution. Exactly.
All of the above. All right, Donna, we'll turn to you for a last question, comment, and then Danielle, back to you before we wrap up for the day. This has been just a great conversation. Donna, over to you.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I wanted to make a different comment, but just following on Susan's comment, I think it's important to make sure that like in that partnership between academics and people who have like lived experience that, you know, like this organizing principle that we talk about often is like know when to step up and know when to step back, right? And I think it is important to not have people who have those platforms actually speak for those other individuals, but really to know when it's appropriate to actually use those platforms and that leverage to step back and to allow somebody else to step into that position to speak for themselves. I think that's actually really, really important. I often am trying to do that, like as when I do like medical advocacy, like I realize that people listen to me more, right? Like if I show up at a county commissioner's court meeting and I have something to say about, you know, something that the county hospital did to an undocumented patient, right? I realize that I have a lot more sway. And I also think that I have the ability to say, using that sway and that influence to say, this is why you have to actually listen to this person, right? Like, and then just to bring them with me and to have that person actually be the person to speak. I really don't believe in speaking for people. Like I speak with people, I advocate with people, I don't advocate for people. And I think that's also important. The other thing I wanted to say is that this problem with like criminal justice reform having, you know, the continued challenge being that there is a lack of representation, that I think is also a problem in many other spaces. Like in healthcare, it's a huge problem, right? Like this dynamic, I think historically, culturally within medicine between the doctor and the patient rather than the doctor and the patient, right? Like, I think this is a problem. And it's not just in criminal justice. It's in a lot of other areas, I think. Anyway, that's just what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Donna, for sharing that. I appreciate it. And yes, that's super important. We need to speak with and advocate with. Absolutely. Yeah, not for. Yeah, thank you. Catherine, you wanted me to?
Danielle, yeah, you're over to you for any closing comments or thoughts you have. No pressure, and then we'll turn to Bruce as well.
Well, mostly just thank you. I mean, it's always the case that the conversations in Square One sessions are extraordinary, and the human gifts everybody has given this afternoon, I'm very grateful for. And I'm also just encouraged. I learned a lot today about things that you're all working on that I didn't know about previously, and that really lifts my heart. It has been a pretty intense time and a really hard week in particular. So a couple of you have made reference to that. It's true for me too. I was pretty tired, I have to admit, before this, and I'm leaving this session actually less tired than I was at the beginning. That's saying something. That's not usually the dynamic of attendance at an academic event. So thank you, everybody. I think you've helped me see paths forward I hadn't seen before. I'm very grateful.
Well, and huge thanks to you, Danielle, for all of your thinking and your work and your time and your presence with all of us through this. And we'll look forward to the many continuing conversations next Friday, as well as ongoing beyond that. So thanks so much. Bruce, we'll hand over to you for a few minutes to close us out with this day's conversation and go from there.
Yeah. This was a very big day, I think. I have three sorts of points. So we began the day reflecting on the conversation from the night before between Daryl Atkinson and Marlon Peterson. And we began by talking about forgiveness, which was an important theme. And I think in our group, today was so interesting for me because I think in our group we've developed over this roundtable, over earlier work from Square One, a way of thinking about the process of building justice in the country. And part of what was super interesting about today was that Danielle has been working on that same problem as well. And so I'm going to try and bring these two ways of thinking about building justice together. And I'm doing it on the fly, and I don't know, I haven't quite put together in my own mind, but I think very much within the Square One conversation, I think restorative justice is often a model for us that we try and project out to the policy and political process, and we try and think in those terms about our own role. And so I think the idea of forgiveness was very resonant for us from the Marlon and Daryl conversation, partly because that is how we think of it's part of a process of a non-punitive way of healing in the aftermath of harm. And so we're thinking about our process of building justice as a process of very much as a process of restoration and healing. And Jeremy spoke right at the top of the day about the central importance of healing. And behind that problem is the emotional and physical toll that's taken by violence, and that's what we're trying to heal. All of the damage that's done emotionally and physically by violence, and healing, I think, has two dimensions in the way we've been talking about it. There's a relational component. We're trying to set relationships right again after harm has been caused. And there's a power component. We're trying to re-empower those who have lost power by being harmed. Restoration is partly a project of empowerment, and these sorts of ideas, setting relationships right and empowering, I think flows through all of our conversations. It flows through our model of what practice should look like in under a new kind of justice, a non-punitive kind of justice. It flows through the way we were talking about the relationship between researchers and communities. We're trying to rebalance the power relationship between those two actors who has expertise. So from there, we went to a discussion of the irreducible minimum, and and the issue of abolition was front and center. And abolition was described in a few different ways in the conversation. It wasn't just freedom from human captivity, right? That could be one version of abolition. But Aneka and Susan both said, they use practically identical language. No one is irredeemable, right? So in a world in which, in the justice that we're conceiving, no one is irredeemable. And interestingly, I thought Daryl said last night, you know, he's thinking of a language of reconstruction as much as abolition. And I think that's also very consistent with this idea that no one is irredeemable. So I think we're building a model of justice and a process that would promote justice in our conversation. There are two big challenges that surfaced in our conversation to this restorative healing model of justice. One is that at one level, we want the people who are really, really proximate to harm to have more voice in the process of change, but the harm that they have suffered, it impairs their agency. It is so many times on this call, people spoke about being worn out, exhausted, self-questioning about their own role and relationship to the work. Keith spoke very strongly to this in the subgroup. The second thing is, right, suffering harm is it's an emotional event. It brings our emotions to the surface. And I wonder if part of the emotions that we experience as a consequence of suffering harm and living close to harm in this work, I wonder if part of that emotion is also a wellspring of retributive sentiment. And I'm not sure we've fully grappled with that, because people have also expressed anger in this conversation. I think this very vexed discussion we have of system actors. What is the relationship of system actors to the justice process? Reflects that we're kind of mad at people. We haven't totally made peace with our own retributive sentiment. And I wonder if we need to struggle more with that. Okay, that's kind of the morning sessions. And then and it's very organic, that discussion. Danielle's presentation and her model of this ethically guided problem solving is very analytical, and there are components to it, and there are specific kinds of roles associated with components. The thing that I loved about it, for me, was a little bit one layer below the surface. I thought she was describing in the diagrams values, diagnosis, prescription, action plan. This was a paradigm. This was an interlocking set of ideas and practices and roles that operated systemically together to create a whole variety of effects, that create racial inequality in the system, that create enduring inequalities and injustices that persist across generations and over historical time. Making change is paradigm shifting work, is disrupting the logic of all of these interlocking pieces. So this is not, in this framework, change is not tinkering at the margins. It's a reconceiving of a new logic. And it's entirely, I feel we're entirely on the same page. Reimagining justice, we say, right? That's square one. This is the same kind of project. It's ambitious work. And she said, and I love this, ambitious work requires partnership. And there's a lot of different roles. There's a role for philosophers and researchers and lawyers and organizers and citizens, and that's very additive, I think, to the conversation that we're having. And it also says there are plural forms of expertise. Different people are good at different things, and we have to act together in order to disrupt the logic and create a new paradigm. So how do we bring these two approaches together? This is my last point. I think from a starting point for the square one perspective, lived experience is very, very elevated. And I think we try and center lived experience. And so I want to think about in this circle of values, diagnosis, prescription, and action plan. What would that look like if lived experience was somehow centered in that process? Because I think that's often the case for us. The second thing is that you could look at the diagram and think, okay, this is how you do large-scale change of a hard policy problem. I see it very processually. This is a cycle that gets repeated iteratively over and over again. And we want to make a virtuous circle of this ongoing collaboration between all of these different actors playing all of these different roles with multiple forms of expertise. And I think, this is very political. This is about redistributing power. There's lots of power is very distributed in this sort of model, and it takes power away from the experts and the state. And so I think it's very generative and additive to the conversation we've been having. So that's where I landed in trying to bring these different threads together. I have announcements. Should I go to announcements?
You have the closeout, Bruce. Yes, thank you. Thanks for that.
Okay. So we're going to meet again, and it's in a week's time on April 30. And we will start, the live stream will start at noon, and we can, the Zoom room will be open at 11:30 for people who want to check in then. This next meeting, right, every meeting we do justice in the location that we're at. If we're in person, we would have been in New York City for this last meeting. So we will have a special session on justice in New York, the justice questions that are being confronted in New York City. And that's going to be followed by our closing session on the aspirations for the values of justice. The Justice in New York panel will include Eric Cumberbatch, many people, but including Eric Cumberbatch, who was on the Detroit Roundtable. Vivian will be on the Justice in New York panel, and Danielle Sered from the executive session. As always, we request that you review the pre-reading material. There will be pre-reading material that will circulate. Please note that Danielle's paper has only been, Danielle Sered's paper, has only been shared to the Roundtable participants. So we'd ask when you get Danielle's paper not to circulate that. It's in the public publication pipeline. Boy, that was a pretty amazing day. I'm just constantly I'm searching for the word. I don't want to say amazed, because inspired, I think, by how much people bring of themselves to this conversation. And you know, people bring all of their life experience and intelligence and wisdom and their emotional selves. I wish we could be retiring to the bar as our next step to process this all. And but my heart's very full with all of you today. And thank you so much, and we'll see you next